How are you ding-dong diddly doing there, neighborinos? Hope you're having a flanderific day. Today is Pentecost, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. I might even do a little bit of reading from Acts on Pentecost. But yeah, we're going to watch what happened at Pentecost and why it's important by Bible Project.
One of the earliest accounts about Jesus of Nazareth, his life, death, and resurrection, was written by a man named Luke.
We know it as the Gospel of Luke, but Luke continued the story in a second volume,
called the Book of Acts, and it's all about what Jesus continued to do after his resurrection.
Acts begins with the disciples who are hanging out with Jesus, who's just come back to life, which is mind-blowing to imagine.
And then for weeks, the risen Jesus kept teaching them about his upside-down kingdom, the new creation that he launched through his death and resurrection.
This is exciting stuff, and the disciples are ready to go tell the world.
But then Jesus tells them to wait and to stay in Jerusalem until they receive a new kind of power so they can be faithful witnesses to Jesus and his kingdom. Then he says that their mission is going to begin in Jerusalem, then move out to Judea and Samaria, and then from there out into the nations. It's like a roadmap for the whole book of Acts. Then the disciples saw Jesus enthroned as King of all creation.
So the disciples wait, wondering when this power is going to come. And then comes the time of Pentecost.
So this is an ancient Israelite festival during the early summer, and thousands of Jewish pilgrims would come back to Jerusalem from all over the world, all these different
I believe it was called the Feast of Weeks.
Languages and cultures colliding in the city.
And the disciples are together in a house, which is suddenly filled with rushing wind along with fire. Fire splinters off into tongues of fire hovering over people's heads. What's this all about?
Yeah, so Luke is tapping into a repeated Old Testament theme. When God's presence showed up similarly at Mount Sinai, he made a covenant with Israel and gave them the Ten Commandments. Then later, when God's glory came in a pillar of fire, it filled the tabernacle when he came to live among them.
But that was just one pillar of fire, not many.
Exactly. Luke's making an important point here. This is God's personal temple presence, God's spirit that was foretold by Israel's prophets. And now it's come to take up residence in the new temple of Jesus' body, that is, his people. They've become little mobile temples where God now dwells.
And they start to tell stories about Jesus, but they're speaking in languages that they didn't know.
You know, I really like that analogy there, that were like little mobile temples. It's 100% accurate. When you accept Jesus, you're filled with the Holy Spirit, which is God, and that resides inside of you. So, yeah, pretty self-explanatory there.
Before, yet all the visitors can understand them. What's this all about?
Well, Peter gets up to explain that this is the fulfillment of Israel's hopes based on the scriptures. God's plan was always to use the unified family of Abraham to bring peace and justice to the world. But the tribes of Israel had been scattered because of the exile. Now here at Pentecost, representatives from all of the tribes come back together and they're introduced to their Messiah, the crucified and risen Jesus, so they can now become the restored people of Israel.
And thousands of them start following the way of Jesus.
Which brings us to Luke's tale of two temples. So you've got the temple that Herod built in Jerusalem, where Jesus' disciples worship like the rest of the Israelites. But now there's also Jesus' temple, which consists of people. This temple's meeting together in homes all over Jerusalem, and they were approaching life in a radical new way.
Right, think about it. Many of these pilgrims aren't even from Jerusalem, so they formed these new families, and they're all...
Yeah, so I just want to say very quickly that, and they may or may not allude to this, I don't entirely remember. I watched this video once today, because I wanted to find one on Pentecost, but I don't entirely remember it. But church is not a place, and it is not like a building. Church is basically wherever believers gather and talk about Jesus. I think G and I have talked about this before on other episodes of SFC, but I feel like it's just worth re-mentioning here.
Depending on each other.
Yeah, people would sell their stuff, provide for the poor among them. They ate their meals together. They said their daily prayers together.
They were learning from the apostles what it meant to live as if Jesus is the true king of the world. And it must have been exhilarating.
But it wasn't all fun and games. Being God's temple is serious business, just like in the Old Testament. So you might...
Sorry, give me a sec. Sorry about that. My allergies were really acting up. I had to blow my nose and get a drink because I was coughing like crazy.
Know about that strange story in the book of Leviticus about two priests who disrespect God in the temple and then suddenly die. Well, Luke...
Okay, so a little bit of background information on this, and I feel like I am very qualified to tell this story because I've recently, well, I guess halfway recently, read Leviticus, so I know what story they're talking about. So, two sons of Aaron. Well, let me back up a little bit further and give you a little bit more context as to what's going on in the story. So, God gives all of these laws to Moses on how the priests should act, basically, and how to do rituals and sacrifice and such. So everything is very specific, right? There's no well, you could do this or you could do. Well, I mean, there kind of is, but when it comes but that's mostly for what you want to sacrifice. But how you do it is very specific. Well, I mean, even I guess the options are very specific, but you can sacrifice I don't know, a ram or a lamb or bread and oil and drink and crops and stuff like that. But it all has to be done in a very specific way. So, two of Aaron's sons decide that they are going to, I believe the Bible says, burn a strange savor unto the Lord. So obviously, they know better. They know how they are supposed to sacrifice and what they are supposed to sacrifice. But they disobey. They do something strange. It doesn't really specifically mention what exactly they burn and how exactly they do it. I'm assuming it would be with fire, just based on how it's worded. But yeah, they end up dropping dead immediately, and God is very upset. So that is the story that they are referencing there. And then in a second, I'm going to pause it again and tell you what they are referencing with the next story, which I won't be as qualified to tell, but it qualified enough, I suppose.
Includes here a similar story of two disciples who dishonor God's spirit in this new temple, and they suffer a similar fate.
So there's corruption in the community.
So, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't think I am, but the story here goes that the early church needed needed money for something. I don't quite remember what they needed money for, but they needed money for something. So there was this plot of land that they were going to sell. And we'll just say that they sold it for $100, right? But these two guys, or I believe it was a man and a wife, instead told the church that they sold it for 50 and they kept the other 50. And eventually Peter, I believe, I think it's Peter, it doesn't matter, someone from the church discovers somehow, I don't remember exactly how, that basically they had cheated them, and they end up like exploding, I want to say. Yeah, Acts might be the next book that we read. I don't know, like after Romans. So we may hear about that soon. But if I'm not mistaken, I believe that's the gist of the story.
But the bigger problem is coming from the outside.
Yeah, from the other temple. Its leaders are threatened by this new messianic movement, and so they arrest the apostles, they try to stop them. And this brings us to the final story in the Jerusalem section of Acts. We're introduced to a new disciple, Stephen.
Oh yeah, Stephen. He's on fire. He steps up as a leader among the disciples to serve the poor, and he would go to the temple courts to teach people about the way of Jesus.
So the temple leaders arrest Stephen, and they find false witnesses to accuse him of dishonoring Moses and of being a terrorist who's threatening the temple.
I don't remember that being the case. It very well could be the case, but from what I remember, they heard him preaching and were like, this is a little sus, but you know what? We'll hear him out. We'll hear what he's got to say. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe he's not part of this whole Jesus cult. So they drag him in and they have him testify. And, they didn't really see anything wrong with him at first. And they're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I feel like I'm going to go ahead and get out ahead of them real quick. But Stephen goes on this rant in his, I'll call it a hearing, because I don't remember them hearing that they had brought false witnesses against him and that they didn't like him and all of that. I remember it being more like they wanted to basically question him to see if, like I said, he was like a Christian or not. And then at first they weren't really too bothered with him. And then he goes on this rant about everything that has ever happened in the Old Testament, basically. And he talks about all of the prophets and such, and then he gets to Jesus, and he's like, yeah, and all of these people that God sent, you killed them all. Which, first of all, let me just say, balls of steel. And then, of course, obviously, they didn't take too kindly to being told that they killed not only every prophet, but the Son of God himself. So they end up stoning him to death. But yeah, that's wild. I feel like there was something else I wanted to add on to this whole bit. Well, let me think about it for a second while I blow my nose. I can't remember, whatever.
In response, Stephen gives this powerful speech about how predictable this whole situation was.
Yeah, he retells the whole Old Testament story, highlighting characters like Joseph, Moses, and the prophets, people who are consistently rejected and persecuted by their own people. Israel's been resisting God's representatives for centuries, and so their rejection of Jesus, and now of his followers, is a rejection of God himself.
They get angry, and they start to execute him by picking up rocks and smashing him to death.
And as he's dying, he commits himself to the way of Jesus, to suffer because of the sins of others. He even cries out, "Lord, don't hold the sin against them."
This is basically what Jesus said at his death.
Exactly. Stephen becomes the first martyr of the Jesus movement, with many more to come. But this persecution contains seeds of hope, which is why Luke introduces us to a new character here, a religious leader named Saul. He stands over Stephen's dead body and even approves of the whole thing.
Wait, Saul, you mean the man who becomes the Apostle Paul?
Yes, Luke is showing how even this tragic murder can't stop Jesus' kingdom. And so many persecuted disciples scatter out of Jerusalem, and just as Jesus said, they head into Judea and Samaria. Now, the story of what happens there, that's what the next section of Acts is all about.
All right, and if you want to go watch the rest of those, because apparently they've got a whole series on Acts. It's called Bible Project. That's the name of the channel. But yeah, so I guess just to summarize it, because they went a little off course, but I thought it was a nice video, and it's nice animation too. If you, like I said, want to check it out for yourself. But basically, what happened at Pentecost is they're sitting in this room, and they're all talking, and then like the earth starts to shake, and then these tongues of fire appear like above all of their heads, and they start speaking in like all these different languages. Or, well, it's actually a little unclear if they speak in a bunch of different languages or if they're all speaking like their native language, but everyone else around them just hears it as their own language. It's a little unclear. But either way, that's basically the gist of Pentecost. And then some people believe it, and well, I mean, like people there during Pentecost, some people believed it, and other people said, "Oh, they must be drunk," which is just a wild statement. Because how does being drunk... Well, I've been drunk before, and trust me, I was not speaking any other language. I was barely speaking English. So to know a language that you've never like spoke or maybe even heard before fluently enough to where people who speak that language are like, yeah, I know what he's saying. That must be some alcohol. So I think we're gonna watch maybe... let me see how long we've been going on for. We might watch one more video, though it won't be about Pentecost, because that was the only one that I found that I was like, oh, this was really good. So we're going to do this one. Yeah, we'll do one more. Sorry, I do not have this prepared. We're going to listen to Historical Evidence Jesus is Alive by Testify. You know how I love watching Testify. Oh, by the way, I said, you know how I love watching Testify. I probably cut off there.
Christianity differs from other religions because it's based on a historical claim of a public miracle. The Apostle Paul says that if Christ hasn't risen from the dead, the Christian faith is worthless. Since the resurrection is a historical claim, it's subject to historical investigation. And in order to argue for a historical claim, we need to do a couple of things. For starters, we need to survey the relevant facts, and then we need to examine competing explanations of those facts. First, let's take a look at some background evidence. Number one, Jesus was crucified. We have reports of Jesus' crucifixion in the Gospels and Paul's writings. It's also mentioned by the Jewish historian Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus. Scholar E.P. Sanders.
I believe we've discussed one, if not both of those, the Tacitus and Josephus, on the channel already by Testify. Or actually, I think we've only done one. I think it was Josephus. I don't think we talked about the one with Tacitus. But maybe we'll go ahead and we'll watch that one after this if it doesn't go on for too long.
List this as one of the almost indisputable facts about Jesus' life. This goes against the Muslim claim found in the Quran that Jesus never died. Second, there's the burial of Jesus. Jewish law required burial, even for foreigners and executed criminals, and we do have some archaeological evidence of a crucifixion victim being buried. Archaeologist Jody Magnus says, I believe that the gospel accounts of Jesus' burial are largely consistent with the archaeological evidence. With that bit of stage setting out of the way, we're going to look at 5 different facts. These should be really easy to remember and share with others because they form an acrostic, alive, which I'm borrowing from philosopher Tim McGrew. These facts are A, appearances, L, low status of women, I, immediate proclamation, V, voluntary sufferings, and E, empty tomb. Now, before we dive in, what are some of the rival explanations? Well, either the disciples were deceived into believing Jesus rose again, perhaps they had some really wild hallucinations, or they deceived others into thinking that he rose again. It could all be some kind of elaborate hoax. Or the disciples were telling the truth, Jesus did in fact rise from the dead. First, let's look at A, appearances. After Jesus' resurrection, 11 disciples, the original 12 minus Judas, claimed to have seen him. These 11 disciples' experiences of seeing and speaking with the risen Jesus took place in an atmosphere of fear for their own safety and grief, rather than some kind of expectation or emotional excitement. These disciples, specifically Thomas, reportedly reacted with open skepticism to others' accounts. And in Matthew's account, some followers of Jesus also doubted even upon initially seeing it. All accounts describe...
Sorry, my allergies are killing me.
The disciples' initial reactions as anything but expecting visions or being receptive to the idea that Jesus was really alive. These reported experiences were not brief and confusing episodes, but were public, multisensory, and extended across time. As New Testament scholar Peter J. Williams writes, the resurrected Jesus is recorded as appearing in Judea and in Galilee, in town and in the countryside, indoors and outdoors, in the morning and the evening, by prior appointment and without prior appointment, close and distant, on a hill and by a lake, to groups of men and groups of women, to individuals and in groups up to 500, sitting, standing, walking, eating, and always talking. These appearances were reportedly extended across a period of 40 days and also involved Jesus inviting people to touch him. These kind of appearances described here sharply cut against the hallucination theory. In addition, we need to consider Jesus' appearance to Paul. Paul was a zealous Pharisee bent on persecuting the church. As an explanation for his dramatic change of heart, Paul gave the well-known account of an auditory and visual experience on the Damascus Road. He said he saw a bright light, saw Jesus, and spoke with him. Paul said that Jesus asked him why he was persecuting him, then told him to go to Damascus and await further instructions. This vision also had some intersubjective aspects, as Paul's companions heard a voice but didn't see anyone. From that point on, Paul preached that Jesus was the Messiah and was risen from the dead. His mission was endorsed by the apostles Peter, James, and John, and they also accepted him as an apostle. The elementary creed found in 1 Corinthians 15:3-8 summarizes Paul's gospel. He writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, and last of all, as it were, to one untimely born, he appeared to me also." The majority of scholars, even many liberal scholars, trace this creed to the Jerusalem church and date it to the early 30s. There are many arguments that this creed didn't originate with Paul. The most popular is that the use of delivered and received in 1 Corinthians 15:3, and then the rhythmic structure and parallelisms in 1 Corinthians 15:3-7. The most popular theory is that Paul received this tradition while in Damascus, possibly from Ananias or the other Christians there, and that would place it within 1 to 3 years of Jesus' death. However, I should note that there are several other later possibilities Paul may have received this creed as well. This passage nevertheless has evidential value because it provides confirmation that the resurrection claim started with the apostolic eyewitnesses themselves.
Introducing
Nevertheless has evidential value because it provides confirmation that the resurrection claim started with the apostolic eyewitnesses themselves. Atheist New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann writes, the elements in this tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, not later than 3 years. The formation of the appearance traditions mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15:3-8 falls into the time between 30 and 33 CE. This means that the...
Alright, I thought he was going to mention this, so I'm going to bring it up. This is not like, I know you're going to be like, really, Ultra? No fucking kidding! This is not like the time of cars or planes. So, for Jesus to appear to that many people over, like, a decent distance, suggests that it is very true, because, again, if you're going to fake this, how do you get a bunch of people who aren't, like, near each other to all agree on seeing the same thing? That seems like a really difficult trick. Like, really, really, really difficult. Which definitely lends to it being true. Because, again, if it was fake, you would have to assume that either people want to jump on and say, like, oh, yeah, no, I was a part of it, yeah. Or they're just in on it. They know, oh, yeah, okay, this guy told me I'm supposed to say this, this, and this because we're trying to fool people into believing this. And again, for it to happen in a short period of time over a long distance, at that time in history, again, it would just be a very, 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 very difficult trick if it was a trick.
Resurrection was the original claim of the disciples and not some later legend. So far, things aren't looking so good for the mythic theory. Next up, let's talk about the low estimation of women. You might think that it's an odd fact, but in a patriarchal society, women were not regarded very highly. Here are some noteworthy examples. There's a prayer for an unborn child that says, "O God, let not my offspring be a girl, for very wretched is the life of women." Or there's a mourning prayer. The men blessed God and said, "Who has not made me a Gentile, a slave, or a woman?" There's further sayings like, "Let no man talk to a woman in the street, no, not even his wife." And the Rabbi Eleazar said, "Let the words of the law be burned rather than committed to women." Furthermore,
Yeah, and also if we take a look back on the law of Moses, or the Pentateuch, you can see that women are basically, there's a few categories of women, and you fall in one of these, and either one, it's not a very high standing. The best position that you can be in is you are someone's wife or daughter, and essentially you are property of the husband slash father. All right, that's like the best. That's the best you can be in those days if you're a woman. Then you've got the widow, or the fatherless. In which case, you can't really do anything but hope that others will provide for you, like strangers. I know I've brought this up before, but like, you couldn't go for like a second round after you had like picked crops. You couldn't like go back over it because you were supposed to leave whatever you missed for like the fatherless, the widow, the poor. Um, so yeah, again, not a very high standing. Um, and there's just a lot of different things throughout throughout the Old Testament that you can find where it's like, oh yeah, the feminists would not be too happy. I'll say that much though. The feminists would not be too happy. If the patriarchy were a real thing, it would be from them. As you know what, as a matter of fact, I will go as far as to say, yeah, back in those days, there definitely was a patriarchy. There you go. Again, just not a good position to be in.
Female's testimony wasn't to be anywhere near the level of a testimony of a man. Just as one sampling, there's Josephus who writes, "But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of their levity and boldness of their sex." There's many more quotes that I can multiply here. Go ahead and visit isjesusalive.com, and I will have more listed out there if you want to see them. Lastly, Luke says of the women's report of the empty tomb to the disciples, and these words appeared to them as nonsense, and they would not believe them. Peter and John did check the tomb out for themselves, but Luke's gospel makes it clear that they thought that the women's testimony was unreliable. This attitude towards testimony of women is unsurprising in the light of the legal situation we've described here. But we also found that, in spite of that, the Gospels report that women were the first witnesses of the empty tomb of Jesus. If you're going to make up a myth or you're hatching some sort of conspiracy, you're probably not going to use the testimony of women to make your case. The 2nd century pagan critic Celsus mocked Christianity for this very thing, and why would this group of women join a hoax like this against their own interests? It just doesn't make sense. Moving on, let's look at I, immediate proclamation. The disciples stayed in Jerusalem even when the church came under heavy persecution. This speaks volumes because the resurrection was proclaimed in the very city where Jesus was crucified. For the disciples to preach this so soon after Jesus' judicial murder that their religious leaders set up was to invite the same type of persecution. They could have waited until things calmed down, but they didn't. Peter went from denying that he ever knew Jesus to boldly proclaiming his resurrection just 50 days after Jesus was murdered. Occasionally, the report of a miracle may be allowed to pass without inspection, especially if it's located very far from the place where it was proclaimed and long after it allegedly happened. In contrast, in the case of the resurrection, it was announced on the spot in Jerusalem. The enemies of Christianity had the means, motive, and opportunity to discredit the story if they could. Instead, as a result of the disciples' preaching, thousands of people left their Jewish practices of worship at the temple, started worshiping on Sunday instead of on the Sabbath, and were no longer offering animal sacrifices and started a whole new way of life. They also gave up their belief in a conquering Messiah that would save them from Rome. Something very big was happening, to say the least. Because of the time and place that the message was preached, we can't say that the resurrection was a late developing legend. And given the hostile environment, it makes it difficult to say that the whole thing was a carefully crafted conspiracy for which they had everything to lose and little to nothing to gain. Next, let's look at V, voluntary sufferings. Here's Jewish scholar Pinchas Lapid on the importance of their sufferings, and I quote, "The apostles were willing to suffer for their faith. This is certainly true of Paul, who recounts the suffering he endured, which included being whipped, beaten, stoned, shipwrecked, near starvation, and in dangers from various people and places. Speaking for the apostles after being threatened by the religious leaders, Peter and John say, 'For we cannot but speak what we have seen and heard.' The apostles are then thrown into prison, beaten for their faith, but they continue to preach and teach the gospel. This does not prove that the resurrection was true, but it does show the depth of the apostles' convictions. They were not liars."
Yeah, people don't go through all of that for a lie, for something that they know is a lie. That's just, again, insane. I don't think anyone would try to make that argument in any amount of seriousness. I also would just like to point out that, and he just talked about like one of the disciples, they all died in horrible, horrible ways. Let me put it to you this way. The two that got off the easiest when it came to deaths was John, who was Well, no, not really, because they tried to decapitate him or something, and God was just like, no, he's actually not gonna die. And so they ended up exiling him on an island where he died alone. All right. The next best one is one we just talked about earlier, Stephen, where he was stoned to death. He got rocks thrown at him until he died. Okay? Those are the two that made it out the best. Others were crucified, and Andrew was crucified. I think Peter was crucified. Someone was boiled alive. I want to say another one was tied to like horses and was ran through the streets, basically torn apart. Yeah. Would you do that for a lie? I can tell you right now, if I was lying and they started tying me up to a horse, I'd be like, I lied. No. It wasn't true. I would like to recant now. You can untie me, please. But no, they didn't. Even as they were being murdered in gruesome ways, they stuck to it. So, again, that's just another point towards legitimacy.
The gospel. This does not prove that the resurrection was true, but it does show the depth of the apostles' convictions. They were not liars. They truly believed Jesus rose from the grave and were willing to give their lives for it. Now, it's not uncommon for people to risk their lives for false beliefs. However, they generally don't do so for something they know to be false, unless they think there is a moderate shot of an earthly reward that makes it worth the risk. Offering people something concrete here and now is the best way to start a false cult. Christianity promoted purity and self-control and downplayed earthly power and wealth. Its earliest preachers lived by these principles, unlike what we see from some modern preachers today. It's for this reason that no respectable scholar in academia is an advocate of the conspiracy theory, and the record we have of their suffering cuts against the mythic theory. For if the disciples weren't preaching that a crucified man rose from the dead, what exactly did they suffer for? Finally, let's look at E, empty tomb. We have a tacit confession from the Jewish leadership that the tomb was empty, as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew 28:12-13 says, "After the priests had assembled the elders and agreed on a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money and told them, 'Say this, his disciples came during the night and stole him while we were sleeping.'" This story continued for some time. Writing around 150 AD, Justin Martyr wrote that the story was still being spread in his day. Quote, "His disciples stole him by night from the tomb where he was laid when unfastened from the cross, and now deceived men by asserting that he was risen from the dead and ascended to heaven." We've already discussed that the earliest witnesses to the empty tomb of Jesus were women, and how that's an unlikely Christian invention. Because women were not counted trustworthy witnesses in Jesus' time, the fact that the gospel writers included these embarrassing details of the women being the witnesses to the empty tomb shows the improbability of the empty tomb narratives being invented. Now, someone at this point might ask, well, what if the women just went to the wrong tomb and were deceived? In response, it's unlikely that a whole group of women went to the wrong tomb, because according to Luke, they saw it on the eve of the Sabbath. This theory does nicely account for the report of the empty tomb, since on this hypothesis, the tomb to which they actually went was truly empty, but the wrong tomb hypothesis doesn't consider all the other details in the women's reports. For their claim of having seen the risen Jesus, or for the apostles' failure to clear up the situation, and for the failure of the Jewish authorities to clarify the issue, especially Joseph of Arimathea, who was on that council of the Sanhedrin. Now, there has been some speculation that Joseph of Arimathea simply temporarily buried Jesus' body in his own tomb before moving it on Saturday night after the Sabbath was over to bury it in a common graveyard for criminals, leaving the women to discover an empty tomb on Sunday morning. But this hypothesis has some serious issues. It's hard to fathom why Joseph of Arimathea would provide a new new tomb for Jesus' body immediately after his death, and then remove it as quickly as possible after the Sabbath, and then not clear up the matter after the apostles started preaching the resurrection. Furthermore, this theory can't explain the women's claims that they actually saw Jesus. There's a lot more that I could say here, but I'll leave it here for now. Simply put, the women were not deceived. When something can be explained without difficulty by supposing that a miracle occurred, but not without larger implausibility by assuming a miracle did not occur, that is evidence for a miracle. This is just basic Bayesian reasoning. Now, let's think about this for just a moment further. What's the most likely thing to happen when somebody dies? What occupies the most probability space, so to speak? Well, the answer is nothing. No grief hallucinations, no visions, no apparitions, no conspiracies about someone being raised from the dead, no stolen bodies or reburials. Now let's think a little bit further about first century Palestine. According to Josephus, there were several messianic figures during this time that drew large followings. We also know of other miracle workers and so-called prophets. What happened to these people when they died? Well, exactly what we would expect. They eventually lost their following, and no one claimed that they were alive afterward. No visions, no hallucinations, no empty tombs, bupkis, crickets. These alternative explanations already have a low probability built into them. And on top of that, we see that they don't work very well. If they're already really unlikely, combining several other of them together to get a solution to explain all the data is just multiplying improbability upon improbability. On the other hand, Christianity very neatly explains all the relevant data. Finally, the argument here admittedly assumes that the Gospels are historically reliable and rooted in eyewitness testimony. In other words, we trust them as much as any ordinary document of secular history. And where the documents do recall miracles like Jesus' resurrection appearances, I assume that they're authentic, meaning they describe what the disciples testified to have witnessed. If this assumption is false, then the evidence for the resurrection I've shared is severely limited. I'm upfront about that. Having said that, I'm not begging any questions here. This channel is primarily dedicated to defending that the Gospels and Acts are trustworthy accounts. So be sure to subscribe and also check out my other videos for more.
All right. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add on to the rest of that, but that's a really good video. Talks about a lot of very interesting things, and it's always, like I say, important to know stuff like that in case if anyone wants to challenge your faith. So yeah, thank you for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.